About discerning spirits. It's a gift, Paul writes. It says to another, performing miracles, power, to another prophecy, to another discerning spirits. And discerning spirits is something I realize that I have. And my greater gift being the teaching, well, not the greatest gift. The greatest gift, if we look down here at the end of chapter 12 of 1 Corinthians, we see, and now I will show you a way that is beyond comparison. And so he goes into this, if I have this gifts of speaking in tongues and prophecy and even preaching or teaching or any of that, and I have not love, if I have faith even too, and then I have not love, it's nothing. So we see here now remains or abides faith, hope, and love, these three, and the greatest of these is love. So all these other gifts are meaningless without faith, without hope, and without love. Love being the greatest gift, seen in the gift of God and His Son, Jesus Christ. And in Him we receive righteousness and are justified by His blood. And so righteousness by faith, that it be according to grace, not to anything that we did, that Jesus did it. So we boast in Christ, not in ourselves. And that's the concept. And also it's this gift of righteousness. Grace reigns through righteousness. And we see that the spirit of life is because of righteousness. And so the spirit of life in Romans 8 that Paul is talking about, it comes through the fruit, this righteousness, which we're born of God. We're in Christ. We've received that gift of righteousness. And so it is the Spirit of God, this gift of righteousness producing fruit in us that gives us liberty, that gives us life. Not only from the weakness of the flesh that wants to subject us to sin, to evil, but also we have dominion over death, and we're being raised into newness of life. And so here, this is related to that, and what Paul talks about is through the church, and here he's dealing with those coming out of the old covenant, and they want to bring the church in subjection to the old covenant, the Mosaic law. And he calls it circumcision because that's where it starts, circumcision of the flesh. And so then it puts you back on the law, and Paul says this is just another form of slavery. And he says it's doctrines of demons that are doing it. It's just not men, though men are led away for their own personal gain, and they teach these kind of authority that allows that kind of personal gain, right? And you can't speak against it, and you can't say anything. You can't, it breaks all kinds of truth. And so this happened to me in a former organization I was in as a new believer, the same denomination my father was in, that just these teachings would just destroy our family. And so I'm not speaking negative against people, as our battle is not flesh and blood, but it's against principles and principalities in the spiritual realm. And here we see in the spiritual realm, Satan attacks through partial truth. These doctrines he introduces, there's always some truth in it. Is it true that we need to obey authority and honor our father and mother? Is it true that in Christ I might have to dishonor my father and mother to follow him? That's true. And so Christ is the head. He is preeminence. He is Lord, teacher. He is master. He is rabbi. He is everything. And so we follow him first. We put God's kingdom first, not man. So we're not slaves to men. And Paul uses it trying to help us understand because of our weakness. He says we're slaves. We're no longer slaves to sin, but we're slaves to righteousness. We're indebted to this. there's a spirit of life, and the spirit is life because of righteousness. And so this concept in Romans 8 here is, if you live and see the translations, you need to really look at it. A lot of translations, they confuse people in this. Like this word according, it really means down from, against, upon. The concept is the same we see in the baptism. Jesus came down and he died in the flesh, but then he was rose in the spirit to newness of life. So the teachings of baptism show us we participate in his likeness. So if the flesh, coming down to the flesh, it's certainly death, right? But the spirit, if the spirit of Christ lives in me, it's raising me to life. And a product, it's fruit, right? It's the gift of righteousness, the spirit of life because of righteousness. So it's the gift of righteousness that's producing fruit of trust and rest and quietness, and it's sown in peace. And that's why the gospel is prepared in peace, and it's a ministry of reconciliation, a ministry of righteousness, because this righteousness is like a seed, and it's growing, and it needs to be grown in the right environment. And Paul talks about us being rooted and grounded in the love of Christ, into the knowledge of the Son, into his love that has no dimensions. That's what grounds us to endure. And so we will look intently into the truth and not just go in one ear and out the other. And a lot of it, these doctrines that are introduced, there's spirits behind it. And these spirits are fear, condemnation, and shame, and different types. And what I've experienced in the church is this: the actions of a minister who falsely accuses people, and then he falsely accuses a man. He gets up in the pulpit, and Satan is coming against the church, and so my experience, I sense this spirit there, and it's not God. And so if he is a believer, by his teachings or by these actions, he's given, and I think it's related to this doctrines of authority in this organization, this denomination. And so they're allowing this spirit and to exist, to get a foothold and a stronghold within this denomination. And then they shame people, and then they use these things against people. They lord over people, and then they use these, fears. Like they preach God, and they preach that type of authority. God is thundering from a mountain, and if you come near it, you're going to die. So then they say, well, I'm a minister. I have this authority from God, and if you speak against me, you're speaking against God himself. And so they use these doctrines, and if they're doing it on purpose or not, usually there's personal gain. They've been led away by the temptations, deceit of riches or whatever, power. And so there's usually some personal gain they're getting out of it. That's where the lie comes in, gets introduced, because some minister sees that he can control people and manipulate people through fear. And so somehow he starts building these doctrines, or he does wrong. And this is what I've seen too, and this is what happened to me. This minister, he does wrong, and he's like punishing me, and not punishing. He's showing favoritism. He's not punishing me right. He didn't follow that Matthew 18 process, and then it's questionable whether I did anything wrong. They call it a sin, and the Bible doesn't say that. And so then they said I broke their rule, and you never told me about it, did you? But they didn't care, right? Because it wasn't about me. It was about covering his own wrong. And so then when I asked for mediation to bring it before his leader, he accuses me. He sets me up, and he has these witnesses, and he tries to get me angry because this other minister related to that same thing, he did the same thing. And so he lies. And so this guy uses that too. And it's like, comes against me accuses me of getting angry. And so it's a lying tongue and a false accusation is an abomination to God, the Bible says. And so these ministers are doing these things, and then he gets up in the pulpit and it says Satan's coming against the church. Well, this is how they use the fear and the shame. You're coming against the church because you speak out for the truth, because they did something wrong to you, and you speak out, and then they portray themselves in this authority where you have no right to say anything to them or to speak the truth. So if they walk in error, you can't point it out, which contradicts the truth that if my brother's walking in darkness, there can be no fellowship. And if he loves truth, he would want to have that fellowship. But so the fact that they do this says they don't understand the scriptures, and they don't abide in God, and they don't walk in fellowship, and how can they have fellowship within the brother, and with their brothers? And so what it does is it creates this bitterness. And that's one of the things underneath this kind of legalism is the hypocrisy that's seen. And you're punishing me, and then here you are with your hypocrite big beam, the log in your eye. And then the principle of judging says if the way you measure, it's measured back to you. So if you measure them the same way, they don't like it. So they build these teachings of authority that protect them from it, right? And they use fear. And then what that does, though, it creates all kinds of bitterness within the body. So you have a spirit of fear operating, then you have a spirit of shame and condemnation, and then you have a spirit of bitterness in this organization. And then what happens? Gossiping and backbiting and strife, and because the root is there's a spirit there, and it's influencing this and fear, and that creates all kinds of anxiety and stuff. And so then they further establish that authority, to try to control that. So it's like a never-ending process of, how you can explain it other than just wickedness. And so, but they establish these teachings, and they're creating it itself. And then they teach their children this. And this is what Paul says, you're provoking your children to wrath. You're provoking them to bitterness, because you're producing bitterness in them. You're producing that root of bitterness. It's like kind of like when I grew up, my father's in the same denomination that I would come to be involved in later in life. And I believe God put me there to show me these things. He showed me how that destroyed our family. My father not having a father, he didn't know how to be a father, and then he got involved in the church. And they just, that spare the rod, spoil the child. He would beat us, little kids, and producing bitterness in us. And then he would blame the children, right? And just like, what's the little child? How does the little child understand these things? But this is what they say: you don't need to understand. You need to be obedient and obey. And so it's like you're trying to beat sin out of a little child. But what you're doing is you're creating bitterness in that child and anger. So the children, as Jesus said, wisdom is justified in their children. So the children are a product of their own misguided teachings and doctrines, and then they wonder why all these children leave the church and they don't have fellowship with them. And so it's a product of their own worldly wisdom, not godly wisdom. And so in the church, and so I struggle with this because these people here, not only is I'm getting attacked in the world by spirits, but in the church, and I don't understand, and that caused great discouragement. And of course, God has used that time to grow me and build my faith. And then recently, I've realized I have the gift of discerning spirits, and that's why I could tell that pastor that in that denomination, and that's why it's not, the battle's not against flesh and blood, it's against principalities and powers, principles too. So these teachings of authority and what these people do, this kind of blind obedience and blind faith without understanding, and this is what they teach. And what they're doing is creating slaves to these spirits, and they get introduced through their doctrines and through their traditions. And so you just feel that. And that I'm looking back with lots of hindsight now, because my mind is being renewed in the truth, and I know the truth. So I'm being set free from these things. And these things are powerful in the church, and you see in its denomination, and it's like a cult in many ways, because it manipulates people is what it does. It manipulates you, it controls you, and establishes this authority. And instead of becoming last and being servants and building up the little child in faith, these people destroy little children. They cause little children to stumble. And you see this great decline in the church, and especially between when children turn 18, they're gone, right? They're out of the church. The greatest gap in the church is this age. I think it's 18 to 25 or a little later. And so, and it's the idea, it's like one of the things of the law, it's like when it defines sin, because of the weakness of the flesh, sin abounds through the law. So under rules and regulation, that's what it does. It causes the little child to jump the fence, because he finds that life is elsewhere. Life is not at home under all these rules and regulations. And so you have to build, we distinguish that between looking intently into the truth and being transformed, because what we grow is our trust in God, and we enter in His rest, and we have peace, not fear and condemnation, fear of punishment, because we love Him. We're rooted and grounded in His love. And what that does, it allows us to look into the truth, because we know we're at peace. We're resting in Him. We're abiding in Him. And we know He loves us. We know what He is doing. His teaching for us is not punishment. He's perfecting us in love, and we're being transformed into the image of His Son, Jesus. This is our glorification, and being transformed from glory to glory. And so these spirits that are introduced through these teachings and doctrines, what they do is they cause little children, they enslave men, they cause little children to stumble. And so what you see is no longer do they teach that you can boldly approach God, but you got to come through man now, right? You got to be obedient to man. So these teachings of authority, and then they take away understanding faith. So understanding righteousness in Christ and the teachings of baptism. So nobody has assurance anymore. Nobody has confidence anymore. Nobody has hope. So why would they approach God if they think God is punishing them, and they're under this fear and condemnation by these spirits, and they're under shame and guilt and all these things, and it's oppression is what it is. It's spirits oppressing. As Paul says in Romans 7, evil, the principal evil is that it's warring. This is how it finds the weakness. The weakness is in the member, which is in the mind, because the mind is carnal. And that's why the law didn't work. And so, but in the new covenant, we have a new heart and a new spirit. We're born of God, and Christ is in me. I have this spirit producing life. But these evil spirits would come against that. And so sin, in the principle of evil, is it's warring against my carnal mind and bringing me into captivity to the principle of sin. And so here I am in this, as a child of God, I'm in this wretched state because I have life inside of me, but my carnal mind, I'm not believing in. And so I'm still enslaved to sin. And my mind, I've seared and especially if you sear the alcoholic or the drug addict or the one addicted to pornography, they put their trust in those things. And it usually happens, you see this in orphans, the statistics in orphanages in Ukraine, it's hard to gather those statistics here because we don't have orphanages anymore. But the statistics in Ukraine is probably the same here if they don't find a loving family. But statistics in the institutions, it says that 65% or more will, and the girl. That's why this concept that the young girls, they believe they can't distinguish between love and sexual feelings. And even now, it's like when you interact with those orphans, it's just loving them. These young girls, they don't know how to discern that. They don't know how to. They think they related with sex, and so you had to get them to understand. And there's some churches adopt these principles that you can't minister to women and these things, but it's that's okay if you're going to have women ministers doing the job, but somebody needs to do it, and you can't run from it, because what it shows you is there's immaturity even in these children that grow up. They're adults now. They still associate love with sex. They never, if you love, they've been abandoned, so they have these abandonment issues. They don't know, and so when you start loving them, they're going to think they're going to associate it with sex, and so a lot of the they'll end up in prostitution or things like that. 65% of them, or the young guys, the young men, will end up in gangs or the mafia, and at least many of them can go into the military. And I know in my own life, being abandoned the same way. And even though my father was there, he wasn't. I remember having a conversation with him. I remember once my mother ever nurturing me and holding me, only one time. And so I was abandoned before I was truly abandoned. I had an absent. I didn't have a home before, and I didn't know that. And when my father did interact with my father, he was angry and he would beat us. He was like taking his anger out on us, and so I know now, it's like it later comes out when he will truly abandon us and divorce my mother. I was put in the boys' home, but I know now that he was sexually immoral. He had an affair on my mother, and these things came out later, and he was an alcoholic too. So these things, he had another life outside, but it was being reflected, at home, because he didn't really have a family. But he didn't have a family either. His dad had died, and then he got involved in this church, and these things, they just fed him these ideas that these teachings of authority, spare the rod, spoil the child, and they led him into these things that did nothing but create. He didn't know how to love. Nobody loved him, and they taught him legalism. Taught him how to be a Pharisee, and he destroyed his family with it and blamed his children and his wife. But he was always the problem, and this church didn't help. But it's the same thing. Then I look back, there were spirits there that entered in, and when my father was having an affair, I can look back, and God showed me this when he finally just leaves and divorces my mother. Before that, he was having an affair, and God put these in, showed me this because my mother went up with a friend, and she would go up to, he was supposed to be in this Bible college, and there's no proof that he was ever there, and she would go up there looking for him with that friend, and this happened right before he left. So I think my mother found out, and they were fighting a lot at home. And so I would go to the nearby park at night, and I was so empty and so hurting inside. And it's a painful part of my life. And then I had a neighbor who was doing drugs, and I had a neighbor and so it's very, but see, what happened when my father was having an affair, what it did was opened up this attack, this kind of spiritual attack too. And so that adultery, that sexual immorality, that spirit's there, right? And takes hold of the children, and that's, you talk about family unit, when that's how Satan destroys the family. If he can make it not about fellowship, not about love, and make it about following rules and regulations, or not. A lot of when American, and this is Christian church too. They go off. A friend of mine his brother is, he has 3 kids and he's lost 2, but had no fellowship with them, and he's about to lose another because it's just, he goes off to work and has a great job and makes good money, but he has no relationship with his children, and he thinks, well, I've provided for them, I've given them food and shelter and clothing and provided these things for them, and he's done his job, and he doesn't think that he's the problem. But he is the problem, because there's no relationship there with his children, and his children, as Jesus said, wisdom is justified in their children, and so there's no relationship there with his children, and so, but he doesn't understand that he's part of the problem, and it's not the problem, because and so this is kind of the American lie. We all want a house and a picket fence, and we've justified ourselves in that, sacrificing family, and so then we want to subject them to all these rules and regulations, and creating bitterness, and so the kids become a product of the family or lack of family, and of course these spirits are able to operate in the family. The body of Christ is like a family, so the same concept. When my father, he opens up the family to the church is the same way, and with my brothers, that concept, we're in fellowship with Jesus Christ and the Father. We have this oneness together, and we're in spirit, and we're walking in light, and the blood of Jesus Christ cleanses us from all sin. And so if my brother, no matter if he's a minister or whatever, if he's walking in darkness, who breaks the fellowship? He does. He can accuse me of it, but he's the one that's broken fellowship. And if you go to him and he doesn't want to listen, if he thinks he has this authority, in my case, they even accuse me of being the problem and saying I was disobedient, I was subjected. But that's what they want, is like a blind obedience, and they teach a blind faith without understanding, and they teach their children this because and why do they do it? To justify their own hypocrisy, and that they walk not in the truth. And so that's the reason these doctrines are introduced, and for personal gain. You got false teachers and false prophets who would use these things for their own personal gain to get a lot of, and now the way these ministers make a lot of money is surely, the opportunity is there to deceive people and manipulate people for personal gain. So it's even going to get worse. But if you can't fake agape love, God's love, and that's why faith is active in love. It's truth in love. Without love, faith is nothing. Without these gifts without love, they're nothing. Teaching without love is nothing. Preaching without love, and prophesying and preaching is preaching and teaching a different gift. And Jesus taught, and he taught the people, and he taught the disciples, and he told them to go teach people, baptizing them. So besides this, the greatest spirit, the greatest gift of love, and I would say that teaching is a higher gift than a high gift. Maybe Paul says prophecy is the greatest. I'm not sure, but teaching is certainly what Jesus did and told the apostles to go do. So when I was a child, So for we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when what is complete comes, the partial will be set aside. And there's a double truth here. It's set aside because without love it's nothing. So love is higher, right? The greater gift. So prophecy is set aside for love, the gift of love. But also we see in the sense that it is eternal. When Christ comes and we have, or a fullness into his image, we experience a redeemed body too. We will no longer need that, right? So prophecy is set aside, teaching is set aside, but love is not, right? Love is eternal, and it's without dimension, so it's infinite. So it will always be knowing, coming to the knowledge of God's love for us, which is an incredible thing. We will never get bored in eternity. When I existed a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, set aside, the same word, right? I set aside, like prophecy is set aside. I set aside childish ways. And so, for the present, and this is important because we're rooted and grounded in love. Without love, it's just legal, a bunch of rules and regulations. If the love of God is not established in my heart, I can't really become a man. So, but when I became a man, I set aside childish ways, where we're looking through a mirror, obscurely, but then face to face, I know in part, and I will fully know as I am fully known. I'll be fully known as I am fully known. So this mirror, obscurely, it's like a child. See, because of the carnal mind, we have unbelief. And so as the mind is being renewed and I'm being transformed and I'm rooted and grounded in this love and I'm looking intently into truth, then I start seeing, my mind is renewed. I start seeing who I really am. I'm no longer a child, but I'm becoming, as John says, the child knows God and his sins are forgiven. But a young person adds to this, I know God, I know my sins are forgiven, but I abide in the truth, and I've overcome the evil one. And then the Father knows him who is beginning, which is Jesus, which is the word of life, which is the truth. And so a Father is fully known, or, not completely. We never really truly attain it until Jesus comes back. But a Father is founded in that. And so he set aside childish ways. And so how do you do this? You look into the law of liberty. And so, see, a child is looking into it and it's kind of blurry. It's not focused. The concept of faith is perfecting us in his love, and faith it's the concept of the telescope. The object is the scope. So the object is Jesus. We fix our eyes on Jesus. There's Jesus, but how do I fix it? Well, the tele part is the lens. It focuses it. So the lens, my object is Jesus, the truth, the word of life. Faith is how I focus it and get it in. And as I look, my faith increases. I'm giving a measure. Jesus is the author of it and perfecter. So my faith is being increased by looking into the truth. And this is the law of liberty. And this is what Jesus said. The true disciple abides in the truth. He will know the truth. And the truth sets him free, or he experiences his liberty. So now we see how this process, right? I have to look intently into there. And so we see faith. We see Jesus, the word of life. We see how faith brings it into focus like a mirror, looking clearly into a mirror. But we see, how do I endure, right? How do I endure the storms? How does Peter walk on water? And so we see faith, hope, and love, right? And hope and faith exists as assurance. and hope and conviction. And so the love of God is poured out into our hearts. We have this assurance that we are His children, and we have His testimony, and we have peace. We've been cleansed by the blood of Jesus Christ. We have testimony, blood, and the water is sanctifying us. We're enduring, looking into the truth, not it going in one ear and out the other, but we're allowing it to change us. So we see faith gives us focus. The scope is Jesus. So the word of life, we're looking intently by faith into the word of life. And it's renewing our minds. It's bringing us into clearer focus. And the Spirit is working in that too, guiding us into the truth and renewing, giving us life in this love. So that's what keeps us enduring during the storm, right? Is hope, faith, and love. And the greatest is love. And so this is the child being rooted, grounded, and established in love and faith and hope. And so he will endure, right? And so faith says that he is learning to set his eyes on Jesus, looking intently into the word of life. And hope is established. Hope is we have this anchor for the soul, and that translation says hope, but that the anchor is we have it in faith because it exists, assurance, hope. And so faith is helping us to believe in that hope too, and love. It's like, so faith and hope and love, they're interconnected, and so it's like truth and love. Faith is active in love, and we abide in hope, faith, and love. And love is the greatest. So it's the greatest gift.